I was first introduced to the concept of the stealth aircraft or fighter jet back in something like 1986 or 87. I was around 14 years old at the time, and a friend of mine had told me about this mystery jet in the US Air Force that was unofficially, or perhaps even officially, known as the F-19. Why? Well, being into planes and military stuff myself, this was of course the Cold War. I knew all about the F-14 Tomcat from the film Top Gun, the F-15 Eagle, and the F-16 Falcon. These are all great US aircraft. There was an F-17, which essentially was a development aircraft that became the F-18 Hornet. And then, of course, there was the F-20 Tiger Shark. I'll also add that there was no F-21 for obvious reasons, because the Soviets had it as their workhorse fighter in the form of the MiG-21. All of this left a rather obvious gap in these sequential numbers: 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and then 20. So at this time, aviation enthusiasts, professional and amateur alike, we all knew that there was some kind of undeclared aircraft existing in the US arsenal. We also knew that there was no official F-19 aircraft. There had been an announcement back in 1980 that the Pentagon was funding several advanced technology programs for aircraft and missiles of various types. A year later, 1981, it had even announced that the contract for a so-called invisible bomber had gone to the aeronautical defense company Northrop. This was called the Advanced Technology Bomber, or ATB, and within a few years it was being called the Stealth Bomber. The acknowledgement of the existence of a program to build a radar-evading long-range bomber was at least public, but this was not the case when it came to any equivalent stealth fighter. But it defied logic that there wasn't one. If there was an ATB, then there must also be an ATF. This, of course, is not to be confused with the later official ATF program, which resulted in the F-22 and F-23 aircraft. Now, there had been rumors already in the 1970s that Lockheed, the team behind Skunk Works and the famous SR-71 Blackbird, was working on a stealth project for the US Air Force, but there were no facts or details about it. It didn't take a genius to conclude that there must be an ATF program for a single-seat aircraft of some kind. The conclusion made by the outside world, therefore, was that this must be the missing F-19 aircraft. In the absence of any information, aviation experts and novices alike, no doubt Soviet spies too, began speculating and piecing together a puzzle by way of out of what little public information there was known about these tantalizing new stealth aircraft. So in 1986-87, I set out on a quest to find out as much as I could about these mysterious aircraft. And don't forget, this was all before the age of the internet. For years, industry experts, analysts with technical backgrounds, and assorted scientists had begun quietly assembling an image of what these stealth aircraft might look like. These needed to include a list of likely low observable requirements, such as minimal radar and infrared signatures, reduced noise, smoke, and contrails in the sky, as well as low overall visibility, etc. For the technically minded, some began creating images of what they could or should look like in terms of a fighter or a bomber. One approach was to start with the understanding that it would use the F-404 aircraft engine. Designers would need to move these deeper inside the aircraft fuselage to reduce heat, exhaust, noise, and smoke. They would also need to design some kind of fan or open-baffled exhaust bed of some kind, and all external objects such as fuel tanks and bombs would need to be internalized in order to reduce radar signature. And based on the understanding that it was indeed Lockheed building the stealth fighter, another good starting point for endless speculation was to begin by modifying the already proven SR-71 Blackbird along these same technological lines. Regardless of shape, it was also understood that the stealth aircraft required using a lot of lightweight composite materials. such as ferrites. This was the material used, for example, by TDK on its old cassette tapes. Stealth aircraft needed outer skins that were both radar absorptive and radar reflective in order to minimize being seen by enemy radars. Among the cadre of professional stealth watchers was Bill Sweetman, who was always seemingly one step ahead of everyone else. He was the technical editor of 2 European aerospace magazines, including International Defense Review. This was a man who author Tom Clancy once called a genius in the field. In January 1986, Sweetman published a book called Stealth Aircraft: Secrets of Future Air Power. This was the first book to describe openly the secret revolution taking place in military aviation. It included chapters on the history of stealth, the theories of stealth, and a chapter each on the stealth fighter and the stealth bomber. Bill Sweetman also worked together with aviation illustrator Mike Babcock to develop a 60-foot stealth fighter with a curved double delta wing, somewhat like the space shuttle. They also came up with a concept design for the stealth bomber, which was essentially a flying wing. Their book even included a cutout view of what might be inside. This book sparked a frenzy of new attempts in 1986, mainly by magazine publishers, to come up with their own conjectural designs for the putative stealth fighter and stealth bomber. And as you can see, there were quite a few of them. Then, in the summer of 1986, everything changed. The Illinois Model Kit Company, also famous for paints and glues, Testers, took the idea one step further and produced a model plastic kit of its own speculative F-19 design, and things went bananas. The kits hit the newspapers and airwaves as it was the first physical proof, quote-unquote, of the F-19's existence. Congressmen in the US even began demanding to know why a copy of the US Air Force's best-kept secret was now on sale in every toy store. The US company had a partnership with an Italian equivalent, Italieri, and together they began producing and selling millions of these F-19 model aeroplanes. And by the end of the year, there was stealth mania around the world. More and more magazines sought to cash in on the interest in stealth aircraft. Article after magazine article appeared about the secret world of stealth and all of its related technologies. These were followed by even more speculative aircraft designs. In 1987, more model kit companies jumped on the bandwagon and launched their own kits of putative stealth aircraft, including models of the stealth bomber, now firmly designated the B-2 because this was the next logical step after the decades-old B-1 bomber. To avoid any claims of copyright, each company needed to come up with a design that was different from the original Tester's design, and therefore a series of evolving designs made them more and more fantastical, futuristic, and more elaborate. Also in 1987, the software games maker Microprose licensed the F-19 design from Tester and created a game called Project Stealth Fighter, which was a combat flight simulator for the Commodore 64 and ZX Spectrum home computers. It even took home an award for Best Military or Strategy Computer Game in 1987. Microprose immediately announced it was working on an improved version of the game for the PC and Amiga. Then, at the end of the year, 1987, the Testers company dropped its next bombshell. It had conceptualized a model for a counterpart Soviet stealth fighter, which it called the MiG-37B Ferret. This was pure speculation by the company, but they claimed to have used extensive research, development, and input from leading military think tanks. The result was a new aircraft that looked a cross between the X-Wing fighter in Star Wars and the MiG-31 Firefox from the Clint Eastwood movie in 1982. Now, I remember building both the F-19 and the F-37 Ferret models as kits. The contrast between the two designs was completely clear. The sophisticated F-19 Western jet was smooth, rounded, and contoured. For the MiG-37B, the company's sales materials described it as a formidable weapon, but noted that the Soviets no doubt had a, quote, more conventional stealth aircraft. This was classic Cold War propaganda of the day. The implied message was that their technology was no match with that of the West. and therefore the Soviet stealth aircraft was angular, boxy, and frankly ugly. In a roundup of stealth plastic model kits in January 1988, the Scale Model International magazine called the MiG-37 the son of Firefox, describing it as having touches of the F-14, 15, 18, and the MiG-29 rolled in one. The journalist wrote that as far as the design was concerned, it was, quote, certainly less stealthy in shape than its American counterparts. With a summary of the situation with regards to stealth in early 1988, the author concluded, quote, the American fighter and bomber exist, but the design is just as much a mystery as when the first kit was issued. The writer added that only recently Aviation Week and Space Technology, the journal, had reported on the arrival of the Revell B-2 and the Testers Artillery Soviet stealth kits in the US hobby shops, noting that the latter was, quote, in fact, very close to the actual F-19, end quote. The journalist wrote that, quote, it had been reported that someone from Lockheed, when asked about the various designs, smiled and replied along the lines of, just you wait until you see the real thing, end quote. Unknown to anyone outside top-secret military circles, the Testers Artillery model of a crude Soviet stealth fighter was in fact the closest conceptualization so far that anyone had ever made of the real F-19 aircraft. In 1988, I turned 15, and little old me had been collecting public materials about stealth aircraft and technology for close to 2 years. Then, in early November, I went to my usual work doing an afternoon newspaper delivery round after school, and there on the front page of that day's The Australian newspaper, 9th of November, was this article. B-2 stealth bomber quietly glides in. It featured an official artist's impression of the secret Northrop bomber. And although it was a flying wing, it looked nothing like any of the models we had all been salivating over. The jagged teeth of the trailing edge was certainly a surprise. Not only that, the public unveiling of the most secret bomber in history would be held in less than a fortnight. I had a rush of emotions. Analysis in Miltech magazine, by then one of my favorite magazines, stated, quote, trying to analyze the picture to dig out technical details would be a rather futile exercise, end quote. Despite being official, the artist's impression, quote, does not necessarily imply that it is accurate, end quote. US Air Force officials had warned that several details had been omitted or deliberately altered, and the writer of this article wondered whether the absent tail fins were included in those omissions. But what's remarkable, a few weeks earlier, the Honda Motor Company had released a television commercial for a new high-technology car. This was the Honda CRX, featuring a half-size mock-up of their idea of the stealth bomber. The creative agency behind this publicity stunt had gone to the trouble of building a 10,000-kilo rolling mock-up model of the secret plane in their television advert. Just like the designers and model makers before them, they speculated as to what it could look like. It turned out that this advert, launched before the B-2 bomber, was almost a true depiction of the as yet still classified shape of the B-2 bomber, including those jagged teeth. It is not known whether the company was ever questioned by US authorities about this. Now, I never saw or heard of this advertisement, so the image in the newspaper that day was the first time that I ever laid eyes on the B-2 bomber. And then, the very next day, when I got back to work again, I saw the following article, Stealth Fighter Unveiled. It too looked nothing like the F-19 that I had been used to seeing all these years. You might even describe it as a folded paper aeroplane made of black paper. The article said that the fighter had first flown in 1981 and had been operational since 1983. One thing was for sure, my stealth info collecting days would now go into overdrive. I must have stared at that grainy photo for hours. Just like the image the day before, the angles and fuzziness did a good job of hiding the true shape of the newly unwrapped aircraft. Even the subsequent artist's impression by Lockheed gave little away in terms of more detail. The clever thing about the angle used in the photo was it gave little away about any kind of proportions. It was deliberately made to look short and squat. Thus, when the first outline drawings were made, the aircraft looked smaller than would turn out to be the case. For the next year, no new images were released. Experts and amateurs alike were putting together their own illustrations and schematics of this spellbinding aircraft. These results appeared in various publications. Then, at the start of December 1989, a high school teacher in Nevada captured the first ever daytime photos of this secret black jet. These sensational new images gave stealth fans a fresh perspective on the aircraft's design, which proved to be longer and sharper than had been first interpreted. More images appeared in places like Defense Weekly, followed swiftly by one image of the aircraft flying alongside an F-20 Tiger Shark, giving a better idea of scale and size. The F-117 first appeared in public at an air show at Nellis Air Force Base on the 21st of April 1990. Within months, it became impossible to count all the new photos taken both from the air and on the ground, and all the subsequent articles. More and more details started spilling out. Some of the pilots became unwitting stars as they told their stories of flying the black jet. More and more diagrams, schematics, and cutout illustrations appeared in publications around the world, and Lockheed was also finally free to speak openly about its role in the jet's program, releasing its own diagrams and publicity materials. But by now, as the magazine Popular Mechanics described it in the summer of 1990, it was the end of an enigma, and the feeling was that, quote, the F-117 is already out of date. It relies on stealth technology of 12 years ago and borrows components from older aircraft and is incapable of reaching supersonic speeds. Only months later, the F-117 stealth fighter would go to war in Iraq in January 1991, and even more publicity and articles would follow. Operation Desert Shield turned into Desert Storm in the early hours of January 17, 1991. It was the first televised war in history, and frankly, I remember it being an exciting time. CNN broke the news to the world at 2:36 a.m. Baghdad time. As a Generation Xer, we had grown up with the threat of constant nuclear war and annihilation, and of course from reading too much Tom Clancy. So a conventional war on the other side of the world, being fought using cutting-edge technology over 5 weeks, including the F-117 stealth fighter, had a lot to be excited about. Well, I was not alone in rushing home after school to watch the live CNN coverage of the war, and of course going through all the newspapers and the headlines. With every passing day there was news. Leading the charge were the F-117s and Tomahawk missiles launched by naval forces, all operating in the dark, or what was apparently the worst weather the region had experienced in a century. That first night, stealth pilots destroyed 37 targets across the country, and they were the only ones to attack Baghdad, doing so with pinpoint discretion, thanks to their laser-guided munitions. Iraqi forces never recovered as these unseen precision weapons unpicked Iraq's war infrastructure piece by piece. As intended, the Iraqis could not detect the deadly F-117s, which flew nearly 2,000 sorties in 38 days and literally paved the way for the coming ground war, which was then over in just 4 days. The Black Jets returned home to Nevada on the 1st of April to a hero's welcome. The stealth aircraft had performed their role flawlessly, and not a single F-117 received anything as much as a scratch throughout the entire campaign. For the B-2, the trajectory from that first artist's illustration to the first public viewing was far swifter. It was not yet an operational aircraft. 2 weeks after the initial news of the stealth bomber being released, prototype was revealed in a restricted viewing on the 22nd of November 1988. Invited attendees witnessed the aircraft being rolled out of a hangar in Palmdale, but they were not allowed to see the aircraft from the rear, nor were they allowed any closer than 200 feet. However, the editors of Aviation Week had cleverly discovered that no aircraft restrictions had been applied to the event, so they managed to get the first overhead photos of the B-2 using a rented Cessna 172, These images revealed both its correct profile and the appearance of suppressed overwing engine exhausts. This was a major scoop for the magazine. But the next big question the world was waiting for was, will this flying wing actually fly? The program was 18 months behind schedule. Half a year later, at the start of July 1989, the B-2 began 15 days of low-speed and high-speed runway tests ahead of a planned maiden flight. These test runs gave the public a new side view of the uniquely tailless aircraft. All eyes around the world were on the B-2 as it underwent pre-takeoff tests. The initial flight was scrapped at the last minute due to a technical malfunction, low readings on the fuel pressure gauges. This delayed things by 2 to 3 days. The first nervous public flight of the B-2 came finally on the 17th of July 1989 and proved a success. The maiden flight lasted some 2.5 hours, and pilots described the aircraft as very nimble to fly. The press described the maiden flight as flawless. It also gave the public the first underside photos of the aircraft. The original schedule had been to analyze the data for 5 weeks before attempting any second flight, but the Chief of the Air Force Systems Command, General Bernard Randolph, had said that the results were so heartening that it might fly again sooner. As it turned out, the subsequent second flight, scheduled to last for 3 to 4 hours, was cut short after only one because of problems with an oil pressure indicator. Just as with the news of the F-117, the press and media went to town over the next 12 months with feature articles all about the once secret stealth bomber. More and more photos and details came out, seemingly with each passing day. As mentioned earlier, the original Gulf War, or Operation Desert Storm, began in January 1991, and the F-117 fighter went to war for the second time in its history. The first had been as part of an operation against Panama in December 1989, which had been just days after those initial sneak photos taken by the amateur in the desert. I wonder if this had been a coincidence. The B-2, however, did not take part in the Gulf War campaign of 1991. This was because the aircraft was not yet ready for delivery to the US Air Force. However, at this time, testers released its first accurate model of the B-2 Spirit, as it became known, in 1/72 scale, and now everybody could own the once secret B-2 bomber. The first operational B-2 was delivered on the 17th of December 1993, but by now there was little excitement about either of the stealth aircraft. Now, there were claims early on that, in fact, technology around the world had caught up with the stealth aircraft, making them, in fact, detectable. These were, of course, quickly dismissed. However, some even said that the so-called stealth technology was all a myth born out of the Cold War. But there was now an even bigger threat looming for the B-2: funding. This was because the Soviet Union had collapsed years earlier, so what was the point of building so many of these eye-wateringly expensive aircraft? Congress and the public were now more concerned about the ballooning costs, especially the $2 billion price tag for each B-2 bomber. By this point, my own enthusiasm for stealth had somewhat died away. I was no longer a teenager, and everything stealth was now public knowledge. Gone was that feeling of being in on the great military secret. And of course, even Bill Sweetman had now written a whole book about the secret history of the F-117, which I bought, naturally. Books like these revealed a lot of the previously unknown history of the F-117's development, including the HAB Blue prototype built in 1978. I will end the video with this anecdote. In 1992, I went to the Australian International Air Show at Avalon, just outside Melbourne. Some were there to see the giant Antonov AN-124, and others were there to see the RAAF F-111s and the visiting US Air Force F-18 and RF-4C Phantom aircraft. I, however, was on a mission to head straight to the Lockheed stand. I remember going to the pavilion and finding that Lockheed stand, only to find that it was completely empty, apart from a man who looked like he was tidying up. I went up and said g'day and explained that I was here to find out everything they had about the F-117 aircraft. I probably even rambled on about how much I loved the aeroplane. "We don't have anything," he said, and he must have seen the look of deep disappointment in my young face. But then he turned around and said, "Wait here 1 second, mate," and he went behind the curtain. And when he came back, he handed me this official Lockheed publication all about the F-117 with a wink. Whoever this guy was, he made me feel the luckiest man alive at the air show. Despite all the articles and books I had collected over the years, this official guide to the Black Jet had loads of exclusive new photos, and there was more behind-the-scenes information and fresh images of how the aircraft was created, what life was like as a pilot behind the scenes, and other insights. I'll show the rest of it without any more voiceover. Well, 3 decades later, I still have all this material, and I thought I have to do something with it. So I made this film. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you do, why not give it a thumbs up? I'm Jesse K,